that younger, all of us will be there. That's what I'm hoping for. I'm a little better this afternoon than I was this morning. But I want tonight to go back and study the book of Daniel with you. Now, I didn't do as good a job last time as I hope that I can do tonight in studying the book of Daniel. It's probably one of the most fascinating books in the Bible to me. When you read about Daniel and you learn about Daniel, he was a very, very intriguing and wonderful person. Now, there wasn't many like Daniel. In fact, when you read the Bible and study about all of God's people, Daniel stands out among the very best of all of God's people. And I'll tell you why in just a few minutes. But the book of Daniel, and you know, we looked at it a little bit, and I wasn't doing all that good with my health and all at that time, and I'm still not, but I want us to look at Daniel from the standpoint, Daniel's life and his ministry. Daniel's life and his ministry, it bridges the entire 70-year reign period of the Babylonian captivity. Now, we all know in the Babylonian captivity, now remember this is like Bible study, so y'all can talk back to me while we're doing this. In the Babylonian captivity, there was a king, and he's prominent in the story of Daniel. Anybody remember the old king? Nebuchadnezzar. Thank you, Ian. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, somebody said, well, what kind of a fellow was Nebuchadnezzar? Well, we're going to find out tonight a little bit about Nebuchadnezzar. But you know, old Nebuchadnezzar was like a lot of people. He wanted whatever it was that he wanted, and it didn't matter what it was and what it took to get it. And that was kind of the way Nebuchadnezzar was. Now, in the book of Daniel, we learn about the fact that Daniel himself, he was caught up in the Babylonian captivity. He was only like 16 years old when Daniel was captured, and he was taken as a captive. And he was in captivity with them from the time he was 16 years old. Now, Daniel, being a special individual, you know, sometimes we run across our young people. I think all of our young people are special. Every single one of them, including you. All of them. Everybody's special, our young people are. Now, Daniel was a special person. And I'll tell you a little bit about why he was special. Daniel became God's mouthpiece to the Gentile and the Jewish world. That was God's plan for Daniel all the way through. Daniel was God's mouthpiece. Now, what does that mean? God's mouthpiece. I'll tell you what it means. It means whatever God wanted those people to know, he would tell Daniel, and Daniel he'd go talk to the people. He'd tell the people about it. One of the most intriguing things about Daniel was the fact that God allowed Daniel to do certain things that ordinarily others couldn't do. Had a lot to do with the interpretation of dreams. Now, as I said last time, and we talked about this, I guess everybody in this room's had a dream before, right? Okay? Whenever you dream something, you may have good dreams, you may have bad dreams, but have you ever thought much about what a dream might actually mean? Have you ever thought about the interpretation of a dream? I mean, you dream something and you think about it for a few minutes and you think, well, what in the world could that possibly mean? I remember years ago, and y'all heard me say this before, I dreamed that Vicky turned into a hubcap. I'm serious with you. I dreamed she turned into a hubcap. And I was thinking, what in the world does this mean? Now, I don't know what it ever meant. She didn't ever turn into one. But I actually dreamed that. That was real. Now, there are other things. Sometimes we dream silly dreams, like that dream. And sometimes we dream dreams that might have some significance of something that might have happened in the past. Anybody ever had a dream about something that went on in the past? Shake your head this way. Some of you have. And sometimes we might actually have a dream that might fundamentally mean a little something about the future. You know, we might be dreaming something and all at once we wake up and we say, man, I've dreamed about this before. Anybody ever done that before? Yeah. You dream it and you say, well, man, I've been here before. Yeah, you dream something that come to pass. Well, in the book of Daniel, it's probably one of the most interesting things about Daniel. Daniel was able, because of God, to interpret the dreams of the old king. Not only that, but Daniel was able to put, as the mouthpiece of God, he put in perspective the information of that dream for the old king. Now, sometimes it was good, sometimes it wasn't so good. But nevertheless, Daniel was God's mouthpiece to the Gentile and to the Jewish world, and that was God's plan. Now, I want you to remember how many chapters there is in the book of Daniel. Does anybody remember how many I told you there was there before? There's only 12 chapters in the book of Daniel. It only takes just a few minutes if you're a pretty decent reader. I'll say a few minutes. It takes a little longer than a few minutes. It takes a while to read the book of Daniel. But in all honesty, these 12 chapters are some of, you'll get interested in it. Anybody ever picked up a book and you begin to read it and it became so interesting that you just couldn't put it down? Well, I'm here to tell you, the book of Daniel is that way. If you start reading the book of Daniel and you start reading from chapter 1, you go into chapter 2, it won't be long. You'll figure out, I can't put it down. I'm going to look all the way through and I'm going to read my 12 chapters in the book of Daniel. Now, 9 out of the 12 chapters in the book of Daniel deals with dreams. It deals with, or is surrounding the translation of dreams. And that's a pretty intriguing thing. Now, God reveals to Daniel. And how does God reveal to Daniel? He does so miraculously, as God does during this period of time. He reveals to Daniel through dreams involving certain things. Now let me tell you, sometimes God would use things to allow this. There would be trees, there would be animals, there would be beasts, there would be images. There'd be all kind of things that God would allow Daniel in the revealing of these dreams. And he would allow Daniel to understand it. Now, as you think about this, the author of the book of Daniel. Who do y'all suppose the author is? Daniel. That's right. I told you that last time. Daniel is the author of the book. So that's not a hard thing to remember. Daniel is the author, okay? Now, Daniel himself. Let me tell you a little bit about Daniel himself. Daniel was from nobility. You know, he was a notable individual. He came from a good family. He was not only that, but these were families where children, they didn't have any blemishes. Now, let me tell you about that. I don't know about y'all, but I figure that everybody in here has some form of a blemish. Don't we, Pam? Yes. Okay. No, I can phone with her. But anyway, I know I got blemishes, and we all talk about the blemishes, the little things, you know, the imperfections. None of you have got any of those things, I know, and I'm just playing with Pam because she's always been beautiful to me. She's a good friend. But when you think about these things, the blemishes, Daniel came from nobility from a standpoint that Daniel was picked out of a group where there's supposed to be perfection. There's supposed to be everything good and nothing bad about Daniel. Well, that's probably pretty close to being true when you read about Daniel. He was a person taken out of nobility, and that sort of meant without blemishes or problems or things of that nature. So, Daniel became something special here. Not only that, but he was a highly educated individual because of the fact that he was very capable, and we can see that from the reading of the book. He was a highly educated, understanding a lot about science and things of that nature. He had a very broad spectrum when it came to information. So we know he was a highly educated individual with a high intellect. Okay? Now, not only that, but in thinking about Daniel, the name was given to Daniel as Belteshazzar. Okay? There was another name given to Daniel, Belteshazzar. Now that name meant, as I told you last time, I'm going to go over it again with you, that name actually meant Bel, protect his life. Okay? So Belteshazzar. Now, as we go through and we read in the book of Daniel, we see other names that mean certain things. But this particular name, Belteshazzar, meant belt, protect his life. Okay? Now, Daniel had great wisdom. There's no doubt about that when you read the book. Daniel had great wisdom, and this wisdom was brought him into a position of prominence. This wisdom that Daniel had brought him into a position of prominence. And now, the reason for that is Daniel was one of the royals, we'll call it that, okay? Daniel was one of those assistants to the king. He was one of the royals. He was one of the wise men. He was one of the ones that the king had a problem. He would come to the wisest of the wise there that served him, and he would go to them and talk to them about the problems. Now, Daniel was one of these, and that's important to remember, guys. Daniel had a position of prominence, okay? That meant that he was special. Kind of like, he had authority. He could talk about things that ordinarily other people couldn't talk about. He could give information on things that other people probably couldn't give information about. Something else about Daniel. Not only was he a prominent individual, but I learned something very important about Daniel in thinking about Daniel. There was nothing in the Bible, no character that's ever been written about, that there was nothing ever negative said was ever written about Daniel. Everything ever written about Daniel was positive. Now, wouldn't that be something? If you were an individual and somebody were to describe you to somebody, would everything be good and nothing bad? Now, I know that wouldn't be the case with me, but if you know somebody like Daniel, there couldn't be anything bad said about Daniel. Everything that you read about in the Bible is good about Daniel. Now, I'll read some of the commentaries about Daniel. And I'll tell you what all the commentaries I've ever read about Daniel is, that Daniel was one of the wisest and one of the most faithful and one of the most truthful of all of God's servants. Now, God made him a servant, and he did serve God, and he stayed faithful to God. Now, in consideration of this, the Bible character that nothing negative was ever written about is Daniel. So, the characterization was he was faithful, he was prayerful, he was courageous, he was consistent, and he had a knack in himself. He was not going to compromise. Now, let me just give you this for a minute before we get into the real essence of the book of Daniel. Whenever we think about the word compromise, and I want y'all to understand this, what do you suppose compromise means? That's kind of where we're at in our government. We don't have anybody to stand up for nothing. Everybody compromises. You know what that means? They give in. That means if I think this, I might negotiate with you and you might disagree with me, but eventually, you know what will happen? Either Pam will compromise or I'll compromise. I mean, we just kind of get together and just kind of make it that way, right? But Daniel didn't do that. Daniel was non-compromising. He was a man that stood for God, and he stood for God to the very end. Now, as we learn about Daniel, we learn about the fact he was a man, lack of compromise, but he was a greatly beloved man. But in Daniel chapter 11, there's over 100 specific prophecies of historical events coming from Daniel that actually comes true. Now, somebody said, what's the significance of that? Well, now, a prophecy is something when somebody tells something that's going to happen when? In the future. Okay? A prophecy is something that God's enabling somebody to talk about something that's going to happen sometime in the future. Not in the past, but in the future. Now, Daniel, in chapter 11, there's over 100 events in that particular area that actually comes true, from Daniel. Now, that shows you the relationship between God and Daniel himself. Now, in Daniel chapter 2, that's where we find in the very beginning there that old Nebuchadnezzar, the king, he has taken all of God's people captive, and they are there. Daniel's there. He's got a prominent position in the king's court, but the old king has a dream. Now, in this dream, Nebuchadnezzar, he reveals his dream. He calls out, he wants those within his kingdom, within his the realm of his kingdom, he wants the wise to come and interpret that dream. Only thing is, he said, now, you come and interpret my dream and tell me what my dream means. Now, there's a problem with that. And nobody there can do that. You know, nobody there can do that. But Daniel can. And the reason Daniel can is because of God. And because of the relationship between Daniel and God. So, all the others, the king said, no, if you can't do it, then I'm going to kill you, you know. Well, wouldn't you have hated to have been one of them that didn't have God on your side? That'd been tough, wouldn't it? You'd been called on to interpret the dream and said, well, I can't interpret that dream. He said, well, man, I'm going to kill you. But not Daniel. You see, that sort of allows us to understand the relationship of Daniel with God. Because along comes Daniel. And in this dream that the old king has, and it's a unique dream. I think most of y'all probably have read that. I hope I've encouraged you to do it anyway. But along comes Daniel. And Daniel, he goes into the head man, Arioch, and he tells him, and this man says, look, king, I know somebody that can do that. And he brings in Daniel. Now, how does he know somebody that can do that? Because Daniel's already done this before. Now, he brings in Daniel. And Daniel interprets the dream. In consideration of Daniel interpreting the dream, the king he's forbid the killing of all the wise men. He says, Daniel interprets the dream, but is the old king going to go along with it? In Daniel chapter 2, in verse number 27 and 28, now I read this to you last time. I want you to remember what happens here. Daniel answered, after he has interpreted the dream for the old king and what's happened here, and Daniel answers it this way. Daniel answered in the presence of the king, and he said to him, he said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, and the magicians, and all the soothsayers, can they not show the king? Now, why is Daniel doing that? Because Daniel knows nobody can except God. And then he says to this, but there is a God in heaven. Now, what's prominent about that? Who does Daniel give the credit to? Does he give it to himself? Does he take the lead role? He does. He takes the fact that God is the one that can do this. Now, I might be the mouthpiece. I might be the one that does it, but it's not because of any reason except for God. And so he gives God the credit here in verse number 28. Now look at this. But there's a God in heaven that can reveal secrets. And he said, and he can make it known to King Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days. And then he says, thy dream and the visions of thy head upon thy bed are these. And then he begins to tell the king what his dream actually means. Now, to me, that's a significant thing about Daniel. Because Daniel is a beloved individual. We know that. It's what we've already learned. But we also know that Daniel was like a lot of those people in the New Testament. He was almost like that of what Christ says. Christ said, I didn't come into the world to do my will. But Christ said, I came into the world to do my Father's will. And Daniel was kind of like a Christ-like being in the fact that he said, it's not me, but there's a God in heaven that can do this for you. And through Daniel, the dream was interpreted. Now, as we go further, and as we learn a little bit more about the book of Daniel, in chapter 3, there are three very important people here in chapter 3 that we come to understand. They are Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They are promoted. The Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, these men, they are very prominent in there because they're promoted too. But the fact of the matter is that these men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, when it came to pass that old Nebuchadnezzar had an image erected and built up, and in the image they said, now look, whenever you hear all these things go to playing, and we had them described, I think it was in the Bible, as a flute, a cornet, a harp, a sackpot, a psaltery, a dulcimer. When you hear this music, you fall down before this graven image and you worship. Well, it was to a point that these Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego didn't do it. Now, y'all know what happened to them. What happened to them?
They were tossed in the fiery furnace.
They were tossed into a fiery furnace. And the fiery furnace was so hot, as we learn through the Bible, that even the men that tossed men, what happened to them? It burned them up. It was so hot, the furnace, they heated it up. You remember? The old king says, wait a minute. I'm going to show Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Cast them in, but before you do, you go over and heat that thing up. And heat it up. And heat it up 7 times more. And they do. And the fire's really hot. So when they go to cast these 3 fellows in, even the people that cast them in burn up. But the problem was, you remember what Daniel said, there's a God in heaven. And that God in heaven with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what happened, guys? Y'all remember what happened? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what happened to them? Did they burn up? They didn't burn up, did they? Not even the hair was singed on their head, according to the scripture. Not even their coat, not even their clothes was even smelling like smoke. I mean, they come out of this thing just like they went in. Only problem was, whenever they went over there to look inside to see if old Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego was in there, did they see anything any different?
I saw 4th man.
Saw 4th.
Amen.
Wonder, have you ever thought about that? Anybody ever thought about what that 4th one represented? You know, that's something very important, isn't it? But anyway, old Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they didn't get burned up. And then the king decides after this that, oh man, I got to do something good here. So he elevates everything, puts these men in charge, brings Daniel in and talks about Daniel and builds everything up. And in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar's proclamation of the dream of the tree. Now, I don't know if y'all read this one before. Anybody ever read the book of Daniel about the old tree, the big tree, you know, with all the leaves and stuff gone and all that? Well, anyway, this is all another dream that old Nebuchadnezzar has in chapter 4. Now, in this chapter, it's proclamation, the dream of the tree. And I would encourage you all, because I don't have time in our lesson time tonight, to tell you all the story about the dream of the tree. But I'll tell you another thing about it. Whenever you read this, and this is what Nebuchadnezzar, he says, I saw a dream which made me afraid. And the thoughts upon my bed and the visions of my head, it troubled me greatly. Now, old Nebuchadnezzar's had another, this fellow must have been a dire dreamer, because now he's dreaming all the time. But anyway, he's dreaming about this. And he says, therefore made I a decree to bring in all the wise men of Babylon before me, that they might make known unto me the interpretation of the dream. Well, we know there ain't nobody can do that but Daniel. So then came in all the magicians, the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers again, and they told the dream before them, but they did not make known unto me the interpretation thereof. Now guess what happened to these folks? You know, they didn't make it, did they? But now, it comes to our understanding here, as we read on in this passage, that Daniel's interpretation of this has a lot to do with what we're about today. You know, it's all about the kingdoms and all about the power of the kingdoms and how that tree represents the kingdoms and all that. If you read and I encourage you to read it, because it's so interesting. It's almost as if you can pick up a book and start reading and you can't lay it down until you read all 12 chapters. It's just so interesting. Read about the dream of the tree. Now, Nebuchadnezzar, in chapter 4 of Daniel, I'm reading to you from verse number 28 through 33. I want you to listen to this. This is verse number 28, verses number to going through 33. And this came upon the king Nebuchadnezzar. At the end of 12 months, he walked into the palace of the kingdom of Babylon. And the king spake and said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power and for the honor of my majesty? And then he goes on to say, while the word was in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. Now listen, saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, to thee it is spoken. The kingdom is departed from thee, taken away from him. Now, Daniel interpreted the dream for him, told him what it was all about. And now this has come to pass. The kingdom has been wrenched out of his hand, taken away from him. And who took it away from him? God did. So, he said, they shall drive thee from men. Now this is pretty unique. This is the old king that took all the people for 70 years captive. This is the one that Daniel has served under. This is the one that interpreted the dreams for. Now listen to what happens to this fellow. Nebuchadnezzar's humiliation comes in these next few verses here. In verse number 32, the Bible said, this kingdom is going to be departed from thee, this voice from heaven, and they shall drive thee from men. Thy dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. Now listen to what happened to him, guys. He says, they shall make thee to eat grass as an ox. And he said, and 7 times shall pass over thee until thou know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will. And that same hour, now listen to this, that same hour in verse number 33, this is the old wicked king Nebuchadnezzar. Now he's got to be pushed out from among the people. He's going to be thrown out in the pasture, and he's going to eat grass like a cat. And now in verse number 33, we find that the same hour was the thing fulfilled upon Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven away from men. And he did eat grass as an ox, and his body was wet with dew of heaven, till his hairs were grown like eagle's feathers, and his nails like birds' claws. Now there we have the photographic memory of somebody that has been changed from a king that had all power and everything because of the fact that he did that. Now we look at him and he's eating grass like a cow, and he's hideous and things are bad. Now, this kind of carries us on a little bit further. Nebuchadnezzar, he dies, and along comes, lo and behold, his son. His son is Belshazzar. Belshazzar is made king. And in chapter 5, verses 5 through 9, after Belshazzar, his son comes to be king, this is something that happens. Now this is pretty unique. In chapter 5 of the book of Daniel, we read about this fellow. Now, Belshazzar, the king, made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before 1,000. Now Belshazzar, the king's Nebuchadnezzar's son, while he tasted the wine, commanded to bring gold and silver vessels to his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, now listen to this, shut the lions' mouths, that they have not hurt me, for as much as before me innocent. Wait a minute, I went too far, y'all. I got ahead of myself right there. Wives and all these others, that they brought in the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, and they drank wine and praised the gods and gold and of silver and of brass, of iron and wood. So he's going to follow along in his father's footsteps. Now Belshazzar is killed in chapter 6. In chapter 6, Daniel is promoted. Jealousy prevails against Daniel from the people. And so whenever this jealousy prevails against Daniel from the kings and the princes, then we find another fellow named Darius comes along, and he rules behind Belshazzar. Now Darius is the one that decides that this is how it's going to be. He signs a foolish decree as the result of those that are serving under him. Now this decree that Darius signs deals with Daniel. Now, this will be the last and final thing that we talk about Daniel tonight, but this is one of the most impressive things about it. It pleased Darius, the Bible said, to set over the kingdom 120 princes, which should be over the whole kingdom. Well, they derived and decided we need to build this great big image. And what we're going to do, Darius signs a very foolish decree. And this decree says, and I want you to think about this. This decree says that we shall not find any occasion against Daniel, but we've got to figure out a way to push old Daniel aside. There's a problem with that, though. God's not going to allow it. So Daniel, he gets involved in this, not wanting to be, but is. All the presidents of the kingdom, the governors and the princes and the counselors and the captains have consulted together and established a royal statute. They built this great big statue. And they made a firm decree. And this is what they said. Whosoever shall ask a petition of any god or any man for 30 days, save thee, O king. Now this is old Darius. They can't ask nothing unless they come to you. They can't worship nobody but you. Now, if they do, this is what we're going to do. We're going to cast them into the lions then. Now, I'm kind of like this. Y'all ever really seen a lion? I mean, a real lion. I mean, them things is pretty awesome. They big. And they got bad teeth, and they can eat you up. Now, this is one thing that they had. They had a lion's den full of lions. And they said, if anybody don't fall down and worship this, then we'll cast them into the lion's den. So, as it goes on, the king signs a decree. Now, old Daniel, this is what made Daniel one of the most prominent of all of those people in the Bible. Daniel refused without a doubt. He said, that's not going to happen. And in fact, the Bible goes on to say when Daniel knew that this writing was signed, he went up into his house, and in his windows, they were open, and it was toward Jerusalem, which had been destroyed, reestablished, was being built back. He kneeled upon his knees, and he did this 3 times a day. And guess what Daniel did? He prayed to the real God. And he prayed to God. But these folks saw him because the windows were open. Then they came near, and they told the king. They said, King? Now, the king, he hadn't had a whole lot to say in Darius, about Daniel, except here, Daniel's been in a prominent position all the way through this thing. He's been there with Nebuchadnezzar, Belshazzar, now with Darius. And now they come to him and say, look, King, you signed this decree. And old Daniel, he's not going to do it. We saw him, and he's bowed down over there, and he's been praying. He's doing it 3 times a day. So the king answered and said, this thing is true, according to the law of Medes, Persians, which altered not. They answered and said before him, said, well, look, that Daniel, which is of the children of the captivity, he didn't do it. So what are we going to do with him? What do you think they're going to do with him? Remember what everybody that didn't fall down and worship was going to get done to them? Cast them over there into the lions den. This is one of the stories that you learn when you're a little bitty fuck and you grow up. But I'm going to tell you something. It's a good one to learn when you're grown up too. Because Daniel never failed to pray to God. You remember what the Bible says to us about praying? He says, pray without ceasing. And there's no time limit on prayer. There's no figure that we can put on how many times that we need to pray. There's just no way. We just need to pray without ceasing, a continual prayer. And Daniel was using every aspect of what God had given him. He's praying 3 times a day to the Almighty, at least 3 times a day. And a lot of people don't pray once a week or once a month. But I hope we all do. But nevertheless, let's go on and finish this real quick. So, they cast old Daniel into the lion's den. Jealousy is there. The prince Darius signs this old decree, and no one could pray to no other God. But Daniel continued to do it, and he continued to pray. And in chapter 6, and verse number 10, we find where they turned Daniel in. Now, the king acknowledges something that's very unique to me. When you read this story, the king really and truly has been pushed and urged into signing this. And he's not real sure he wants to cast old Daniel into the lion's den, but he's got a saved face. And so what he does is cast Daniel in there. But before he does, you know what he does? He says, hey, Daniel, you know that God you serve? That God you serve? He's able to save you, and I believe he will. I mean, that's what old Darius said. He said, look, Daniel, I believe that, I got to do this. I got to cast you into the lion's den. But you know what? I believe your God that you serve. He had known all this. He had heard all these things that God had done. He said, I believe your God can save you. Well, we all know the end of this story, don't we? They throw old Daniel into the lion's den. And those old lions, they became not lions, they became kitty cats. They didn't bother old Daniel. They didn't eat him up. They didn't bite him. They didn't even scratch him. And you know, one of the most unique things about this, the king goes back, old Darius does, and he hollers out for Daniel. And when he hollers out to Daniel, he finds Daniel is doing real good. Daniel answers him back. Daniel even acknowledged him as king. And you know what old Darius does? He said, all them folks that made me do this, go get them. Don't just get them. You get all their kids, their young ones, put them with them, and throw all them into the lion's den. And all them got ate up. Now that's Daniel in the lion's den. Now the book of Daniel with 12 chapters. If you ever want to just sit down and read something that's very interesting and can really and truly lift you up when you're down and out, read the story of Daniel. Just 12 chapters. Don't take long to read it. I'll tell you something else about Daniel's interpreting of the dream. There's a host of things that people have tried to take and twist through the period of time, through the Bible, about things that Daniel has talked about. You know, the kingdom that would last forever, the church is going to be established, God is going to be the king, and all that. There's a lot of people twisting all that around to do ignorant things with what Daniel actually did. But God revealed to Daniel the exact thing of what God has done. There's no difference in that. There's no such thing as some of the things that people try to teach other people about the AD 70 principle and all of the things that they say. There's nothing to that. That's a bunch of garbage. What is good about Daniel is the fact that if you take it for what it says, God has given Daniel the ability to talk about the kingdom that would last forever, and the church that would be established and would be there, and that the word of God would last forever. These things are prominent. But the story of Daniel, it gives us a sense of direction to know that if we follow God, and God's on our side, and He will be, if we follow God, He'll take care of us, and He'll watch after us, and things will go just as if what happened with Daniel. Suppose Daniel had decided, I'm not so sure on this. I better bow down to this idol. I better bow down to this statue. That's not Daniel. Daniel was one that the Bible says nothing was ever negative quoted or said about Daniel. He said, look, I'm going to do what God said. Now that's where we ought to be. And now y'all remember that, folks. That's where we ought to be. Whatever God says do, we do it. When He says don't do it, we don't do it. That's the only way I know we'll ever make it to that wonderful place called heaven. We don't have to worry about it then. That's what it's all about. Now my time's up. How many books is in the Old Testament?
39.
What's the breakdown of the Old Testament? Law, history, poetry, and prophecy. How many books is in each? There. Okay. She's a very soft-spoken girl. She's telling me there's 5, 12, 5, 17. Okay, good. All right, 39 books in the Old Testament. How many's in the New? 27. What's the first 4 books in the New?
Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
What are they called?
Gospels.
Good. Who's the author of each one of those books? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Where's the history book at in the Bible? In the New Testament. What's it the history of?
Church.
Okay. What chapter do we find the beginning of the church in?
Chapter 2.
2. Good. All right. Just a little bit of review there. Now, who can say from Genesis to where Daniel comes in? Who can say those books? Anybody say those books? Anybody want to say those books? Can we say them together? Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, 1st Peter, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel. Thank y'all. I appreciate that. My time's up. There should be a need tonight for anybody